Welcome to this music design episode on Paper Mario: The Thousand-Year Door. In this episode, we will discuss one of the most emotionally charging themes heard near the end of the game. We're Counting on You, Mario comes at a point where Mario is in need of a last-minute rescue. Therefore, the music sparks courage in both Mario and the player to defeat the final boss of the game. The soundtrack of this game is credited to composers Yoshito Sekigawa, Yuka Tsujiyoko, and Saki Haruyama. The lead composer Yoshito also led the music team behind Paper Mario: The Origami King. We will discover just how the composer of this tune managed to create such a rousing theme. But taking a broad look at the tune, one thing that is interesting to note is the different time signature changes, especially near the transition points of the song. Not only that, but the tempo changes as well. For example, right here in the beginning, you can hear the tempo slow down. I also have it listed as an automation point down here. And then it speeds it up back into this chorus. So why change the tempo and time signature? Well, anytime we can mess with the tempo of the song, we mess with the listener's expectation of the song, which actually draws them into the tune. It can also be used to create interesting transitions, which we'll see shortly. Now, there's a great variety of instruments containing a combination of orchestral and electronic fare. The intro synth plucks or bells are one of the most signature instruments in the entire Paper Mario score. The next sets of instruments are all from the orchestral. So the first three are strings, just general string sounds, solo violin, and spiccato strings. And then near the end, we have the snares, timpani, and cymbals. Now the next set in the middle here are mostly back into the electronic sounds, containing two basses, a square lead, a saw lead, and some metallic high-hit sounds. Let's jump right into the intro. I'll play that for you. What's brilliant about this opening motif is that it's actually a callback to the very beginning of the game. The opening expositional sequence contains these exact notes played with the bells. This final tune, the whole song, is a way of bookending the game for the final boss fight. So right after a measure of the synth plucks, the strings, snares are introduced. The strings copy exactly what the synth pluck is doing, and then the snares roll into the following measure. As you can see and hear, the change in both time signature and tempo really push us into section 1. So how does the composer achieve such a full sound here? Let's break it down instrument by instrument, starting at the top with the synth pluck. So they are still playing the arpeggiated chord pattern we heard in the exposition part of the game, but it's a more condensed version here. The strings are very complicated in this section, as you can quite tell. So I'll go into this pattern view and you'll see that I combined over 5 different string sounds, each emphasizing a particular range of notes. This is a more effective way than simply using one instrument because it gives a richer and fuller sound. Now the actual notes being played here are mirroring the melody played in the square lead. Listen to how the two complement each other. Moving on to the bass, this is one of the most important instruments in this tune. It gives off a very militant march feel. Of course, this is helped with the snare. Actually sounds like a different song when they're played together. The bass simply plays fourth intervals, and then sometimes a short transitional riff every half measure. Lastly, we'll cover the square lead itself. This is another signature instrument on the soundtrack and provides the song a very retro feel, perhaps a callback to the older Nintendo days. Again, if you listen back to that first expositional scene in the game, it also follows the same melody, but this version is slightly different, being a bit more driving. And finally, notice how I also did the vibrato for the square lead. Anytime you can add vibrato, it always gives more character to the melody. Now let's hear this entire section in full. The composer achieves this big sound by piling similar instruments, for example the various strings, on separate octaves. Even the square lead melody, right here, has additional sounds copying its exact melody. Not to mention, reverb also assists in a massive sound. This section is the start of a subtle build-up that will pay off in the next section. Spiccato strings take the lead, very much complementing the military-like rhythm we hear in the snares and bass. Looking at the strings up top, they hold on this one chord, only the G note down here, holding on. Then they continually rise up, and then keep piling on octaves near the end of here to increase the tension. These spiccato strings play the exact rhythm of notes. As you can see, this pattern is displayed exactly the same in the next measure. Now this is actually a useful technique in the toolbox of a composer. If he can come up with a convincing rhythm section, don't be afraid to repeat it, especially on different sets of chords as we see here. Just before we end this section, we get a very brief transition, with many of the instruments sliding up to form a diminished chord. And here's it slowed down. As you probably already know, diminished chords are very tense. This is why the next section resolves so beautifully back to the home note. For example, if we were to remove this transition section, the change between these two sections would sound incredibly jarring. So let's see what it sounds like if we combine both sections. See how it's too jarring there without the transition? Now with it, it sounds like this. This section gives me chills every single time I hear this. It's such a wondrous and compelling work of art, simply put. Let's take a look on why this is so. So heading right into the melody, the square lead returns with a similar melody we've heard in section 1 of the song. Oh, after the first 3 notes, the melody descends chromatically down. Of course, if you heard the introductory song for the 1,000-Year Door, this melody is exactly the same. Now, one of the more striking changes between this section and the last few is the lack of bass. With no bass, section 3 sounds almost like you're in the clouds and floating. There's also less driving rhythm, which allows the listener to breathe a little. To supplement the lack of bass, the composer does include a secondary bass, which is hidden in the background. And with the whole song, Strings too are less of a presence, but they do join in harmony with the square lead. Again, there's the good old octave trick where the composer simply doubles the string sections on top of each other. Let's play them soloed. Again, as a transition point, they add additional octaves to increase tension. Also, if you haven't noticed, we changed the sound on the synth pluck up top. As opposed to the bell-like sound of before, we now switch to a more square wave-like arpeggio. Perhaps this was done to further break away from the previous section. Lastly, notice we also have another transitional or lead-in to the following section at the end here. We always have to prepare the listener for what's to come. So let's play this section. We start to build the song to a crescendo here in section 4. The bass returns to a pumping staccato rhythm, which really acts as a tension driver. The notes here simply follow whatever the root note of the chord that it's playing. The strings are also playing a version of the melody we just heard in the square lead in the previous section. However, with the bass, it sounds a bit darker here. Again, the octave doubling technique is employed here, especially near the end, with the additional strings. A new challenger approaches the saw lead. So here it sounds a bit more biting than the square lead, and the melody it plays here acts as a counter melody to the strings. The saw lead also uses vibrato in certain notes to give it more character. So you can see the vibrato automation done here. Let's hear all these instruments played in this section. This section is split up into two, the A and the B section. Part A increases the steady build by introducing a new melody played in the square and saw leads. Notice the repetition in this melody. We have this first phrase of notes here, which is then repeated on a different pitch in the following measure. And then continuing on, we see the same melody again on a different pitch, but this time it continues up further, eventually reaching the high climax note here. Strings too join in with the square and saw leads and increasingly build and build until they reach the climax. For the first time, we see the synth pluck stop in this section. As you can see, this is the only section they're not in. But in part B, they return and do this very interesting pattern of notes. Now this might look a little confusing, but we can divide this into two parts, the bottom and the top. The top, I'll outline here, alternates between these sets of notes, but the bottom descends down in an arpeggio pattern. but when we move in this second half, they both play on the same pitch, just on different octaves. And then in this final part, it actually speeds up a lot near the end. This transitions us into the loop point. As a final note here, this final chord is a super condensed chord, a massive G sharp minor 7 sharp 5 over E. This then resolves down a half step to the solid G major chord at the loop point. This is an incredible tune and one of my favorites from the entire Paper Mario franchise. Let's briefly cover all the techniques we learned from this song. Tempo and time signature changes really pull the listener in more closely due to its unconventional nature. If you need to create a massive sound, using simple doubling on separate octaves can greatly expand that sound. Also, using clever transition points between different sections can help prepare the listener. Finally, using past material, such as melodies or rhythms you used before or in other songs, can really bookend an entire game or soundtrack if used near the end of the game. What do you enjoy about the Thousand Year Door soundtrack? Tell me in the comments below, and if you want to help out the channel, subscribe down below and consider helping me on Patreon in the link above. Alright, let's give this song one last listen. Have an awesome rest of your week.